Now, let me introduce you to Jane. Jane wants to build the perfect pension. Now, of course, Jane's imaginary, but let me quickly run through 50 years of Jane's life using a distilled version of the good practice advice you see regularly here on YouTube. We'll start when Jane's 20 and she gets her first job as a junior in an accountancy firm. And the advice she follows here is to put an amount which is half of her age as a percentage to save into her pension. Now, the default for the firm she works at is the minimum. Now, the minimum at the moment is 5% from Jane and 3% from her employer, so 8% total. So to follow the advice, what she does is she speaks to payroll at her firm and asks them to double their contributions from 5% to 10%, which is half her age of 20. And payroll do this, as is common. What they also do is they double their own contribution from 3% to 6%. Now, this partially reflects the firm's encouragement for Jane to save into a pension, but also reflects that the company itself is going to make some savings on her employer insurance, national insurance contributions. They're going to pass these back on to Jane. So let's move on 10 years. Now, Jane's 30 and she's now a manager at the firm, and she's done well. She's earning £70,000 a year. She asks payroll to up her contributions to half her age, which is then 15%. Now, they say that the maximum they pay into their pension is 10%. No worries. What Jane then does is she opens a SIP, which is a self-invested personal pension, and every month, on top of the 10% of her salary that she pays into her work pension, she pays an extra 5% into her SIP. So when her salary hits a bank account, she transfers the money from the bank account to her SIP. Now, so the amount she transfers is £350, which is 5% of her salary. So she's now paying 15% of her salary into a pension, 10% into a work scheme, and 5% into a SIP. So what happens to this £350 that she pays into a SIP? Well, a few weeks after the £350 hits the SIP, HMRC send an extra £87.50 into a SIP. Now, this is a refund of some of the tax that her employer took out of her pay packet, because you shouldn't really pay tax on the money that you pay into a pension. So HMRC pay this back into your SIP. Now, the amount they've given Jane back is based on her being a standard 20% tax rate taxpayer, but Jane actually pays 40% on the highest amount of her income. So she makes sure that in January she completes a tax return, and the HMRC then look at the tax return and they pay her the rest of the tax back that she'd owed as a lump sum. But this time, instead of paying it into her SIP, they give it directly back to her into her bank account. So as you can see, Jane is really benefiting from these extra contributions she's making into a pension. Now let's move on 10 years, and now Jane is now 40 and she moved jobs. So to stick to her rule, she now has to pay 20% of her salary into her pension. Now, her new employer fined to arrange this through the company pension scheme. So she's got a decision to make. Does she continue to pay in to her SIP, or does she simplify things and just pay the full 20% into her company scheme? So she has a look at the pros and cons of each, and a good point for the work scheme is that it actually helps to reduce Jane's national insurance, and it also gives her some guaranteed death benefits that, if she put it into a SIP, she wouldn't have been able to benefit from that. But there are some downsides as well to the work pension. I mean, she gets the pension documentation out and she has a little look at the cost. Now, they charge 1.5% of her fund each year. So how much she's got in there, they charge 1.5% of that each year. Another bad point is the returns. Now, she's looked at the performance of the scheme over the last 20 years. The pension scheme buys bonds, it buys REITs, which are real estate investments, and it buys equities. Now, these have averaged about 6% per year. Now, if you take off inflation, say 3%, and the 1.5 charges, then the real return she's been getting, she would have get on that pension would be 2.5%. So what about the SIP then? Well, her investments that she's chosen herself are a single low-cost all-wealth fund, and that has averaged 9% over the last 20 years. We take off 3% inflation and these small costs, and she's returned well over 5%, which is well over double the company scheme amount. But she decides to go 10% in work and puts 10% extra into her SIP. Now let's move forward another 10 years to when she's 50. She's now reached the point where it's a bit less tax efficient to put any more money into her pension, as she's reached the maximum lump sum allowance amount. So, the tax benefits at the end of the day are going to be a little bit less. However, investing in her pensions is still a great way to invest. So what she does, she ups her pension to half her age again. And so she's now saving 25% of her earnings into a pension. Now let's move forward 7 years this time. At 57, she's become eligible to start claiming her work pension. So she decides to retire early. She got another 10 years before she can claim a state pension. So what she decides to do here is she gets half of her pension pot and she buys a 10-year annuity, not a life annuity, a 10-year one, which will give her some steady income up until the day she gets a state retirement. What she does with the other half is she leaves it invested in her SIP, and she uses pension drawdown when she needs some extra cash. Now, each time she takes cash out of the pot, she gets 25% of that tax-free, which is great really for her. Now, the money she still has invested, she, in her mind, thinks of it as 3 separate pots. The first pot is the money she plans to draw in the next 10 years. And she wants to be cautious with this. So she invests this in an overnight SONIA tracker. Now, this pays pretty steady 5% per year, but it's very low risk, which is what she wants for that. The second pot, she won't touch that for at least 10 years. And she invests this in an all-world index, which, as we said earlier, is paying about an average of 9%, but it can be quite volatile. Now, the final pot of money, she knows she's not going to touch that for at least 20 years. So what she does is she invests this in a range of individual companies that she thinks may do well. Now, they may do well, but they may not do well. But as she doesn't need the money for a long time, she's quite happy with this kind of high-risk strategy for this third pot. So there's a lot to unpack in Jane's journey here, but it's not an untypical journey. I want you to think about what your pension journey's been and what your potential pension journey is going to be. I'd love to know what you think in the comments. So I'm Eric from the Time to Retire channel, and I'll see you on the next one.